I thought I was doing the right thing when I handed my only daughter the keys to my kingdom. After my husband passed away, she offered to help manage my banking, and I trusted her with my very life. I never imagined she was secretly handing those keys over to her slick new husband, locking me completely out of the life I had built. My name is Clarice. I am 68 years old, and for over 3 decades, I walked the busy halls of the city hospital as a director of nursing. I am a woman who built her life on hard work, deep faith, and an unbreakable love for my family. I spent 30 years working double shifts, making difficult decisions, and pouring every ounce of my strength into giving my daughter Tasha the best life possible in this country. But nothing in my long career could have prepared me for the cold shock I felt last Tuesday morning. I was standing at the counter of my local pharmacy, chatting warmly with the pharmacist, just like I do every month. He handed me the small paper bag with my basic blood pressure medication, and I swiped my debit card. A sharp beep rang out. The screen flashed the word, "Declined." I chuckled, thinking it was just a simple glitch with the machine, and asked him to run it one more time. Another beep. Declined. The pharmacist gave me a sympathetic, pitiful look that made my stomach drop. I felt a sudden hot flush of embarrassment creep up my neck as the people in line behind me started shifting impatiently. I knew there was plenty of money in that account, a lifetime of careful savings. But as I stood there holding a worthless piece of plastic, a chilling realization began to settle deep in my bones. My safety net was gone, and the only person who had access to it was my own flesh and blood. I remember the 1990s like it was yesterday. My husband passed away suddenly when our daughter Tasha was just a little girl, leaving me a young black widow with a heavy mortgage and a profound promise to keep. I promised him, as I held his hand in that quiet hospital room, that our baby girl would never want for anything. I was a registered nurse back then, fighting tooth and nail to work my way up the ladder and eventually become a director of nursing. I worked grueling double shifts, sometimes pulling 16 hours straight, pacing those sterile hospital corridors until the soles of my feet went completely numb. I smelled like clinical sanitizer and sheer exhaustion for an entire decade, but every single time, I felt like my body was going to collapse. I thought about Tasha. I wanted her to have the kind of life where she walked into a room and made the rules. I wanted her to be a lawyer. I paid for her undergraduate degree in cash, picking up every weekend, every overtime shift, and every holiday roster I could find. When she got accepted into a prestigious law program, I took a massive leap of faith and dipped into my savings to cover the heavy tuition, so my girl would graduate without a mountain of debt hanging over her head. And for a long time, we were incredibly close. Tasha was my absolute pride and joy. It was just the two of us against the world, an unbreakable team. I remember the late nights we would sit at my small kitchen table, sharing a warm slice of sweet potato pie, talking for hours about her big dreams and my quiet hopes for her future. When she finally passed the bar exam, I cried tears of pure, unadulterated joy. I looked at this brilliant, beautiful black woman in her sharp-tailored suit and knew that every sore back, every missed vacation, and every lonely night had been absolutely worth it. There was a silent, sacred pact between us. I had laid down the foundation for her success, and I trusted her with my entire soul. I deeply believed that my lifelong devotion had cemented a family loyalty that nothing could ever break. Then she met Brad. The shift in our dynamic did not happen overnight, but looking back now, the warning signs were blindingly obvious. Brad was a slick, fast-talking financial consultant. He was a privileged white American man who wore flashy designer watches and drove sports cars that cost more than my first house. From the very first moment he stepped onto my porch, my spirit simply did not settle with him. He had this infuriating habit of talking over me constantly, throwing around confusing financial buzzwords and treating me like I was just a sweet, ignorant old lady who didn't understand how the modern world worked. He would flash this perfectly rehearsed, arrogant smile, scanning my modest, well-loved home with a subtle condescension that made my blood boil. But Tasha was completely captivated by him. She looked at Brad like he hung the moon and the stars. I saw how blindly happy she was, how her whole face lit up whenever he walked into a room. So, like any mother who just wants to see her child smile, I pushed my sharpest instincts down deep. I ignored the glaring red flags. I told myself that Brad was just ambitious, that maybe his aggressive, flashy attitude was just how people in his corporate world had to behave. I rationalized his disrespect because I trusted the woman I raised. I believed that the deep foundation of love and sacrifice I had poured into Tasha would always protect me regardless of the man she chose to marry. I was a fool to think a mother's sacrifice could outshine the intoxicating, blinding pull of a greedy man. It started under the guise of family solidarity. Tasha and Brad had just sold their upscale townhouse and told me they needed a place to stay for a few months while they hunted for their forever home. Naturally, I opened my doors. This was the house where I had raised my daughter. It had 4 bedrooms, a wide wraparound porch, and more than enough space for the 3 of us. I thought it would be a blessing to have my house filled with life again. I was terribly wrong. Within days of unpacking his designer suitcases, Brad began treating my home like his personal kingdom, and treating me like the hired help. He immediately parked his flashy sports car right in the center of my driveway, forcing me to park my sensible sedan out on the street under the hot sun. When I asked him to leave me a spot, he just laughed that arrogant laugh and said he had expensive tires to protect. But the disrespect ran much deeper than the driveway. One Sunday, I spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen, preparing a traditional Southern dinner. I made smothered pork chops, baked macaroni and cheese, and slow-cooked collard greens. It was the exact meal I used to make for Tasha when she came home from law school. Brad walked into the kitchen, pinched his nose in disgust, and loudly complained about the heavy smell permeating the house. He actually opened all the windows and ordered takeout sushi, refusing to touch a single bite of my food. I looked over at Tasha, expecting my brilliant lawyer daughter to defend me, to remind her husband that he was a guest in my home. But Tasha simply kept her eyes glued to her glowing phone screen, scrolling through social media, acting like she did not hear a thing. She let that man disrespect the very hands that fed her. Then came the snide remarks about my belongings. Brad would tap on my antique mahogany dining table, a precious heirloom my late husband and I bought with our very first savings, and call it bulky, outdated junk. He said it ruined the aesthetic of the room and suggested I throw it out to make space for a modern glass table. Every word he spoke was a tiny poison dart aimed at my dignity. I swallowed my pride. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. I told myself to endure it for the sake of peace, because a mother always wants to keep the peace. I foolishly believed they would be moving out soon anyway, so I chose silence over conflict. I would retreat to my bedroom early in the evening, listening to them blast their television shows on the giant screen they had installed in my living room without asking. I felt like a stranger walking on eggshells in the very hallways where I used to dance with my husband. I convinced myself that this was just a difficult transition period. I prayed for patience every night, hoping that once they found their new house, things would go back to normal and I would get my sweet daughter back. But things did not go back to normal. In fact, the disrespect slowly morphed into a calculated psychological game designed to make me question my own mind. It started with my mail. For 30 years, I have always been incredibly organized. As a former nursing director, keeping track of paperwork was practically encoded in my DNA. I always kept my bank statements, medical bills, and utility notices neatly stacked in a dedicated basket on the hall table. Suddenly, those envelopes began disappearing. I would wait for my monthly retirement account summary, but it simply never arrived. When I casually brought it up at breakfast, asking if the mail carrier had come by, Brad exchanged a knowing, pitiful look with Tasha. He sighed heavily, put down his coffee cup, and told me that I had already checked the mail and thrown it away myself. I knew for a fact I had done no such thing. A few days later, my favorite pearl earrings went missing from my vanity. When I asked Tasha if she had seen them, she patted my hand with a sickly sweet smile and said I must have misplaced them because my memory was clearly slipping. They started doing this constantly. They would move my reading glasses, hide my car keys, and rearrange the items in my pantry, only to blame my advancing age when I could not find them. Then the conversation took an even darker turn. Brad started leaving glossy brochures on the kitchen counter. They were advertisements for a local assisted living facility, the kind of place you send people who can no longer remember their own names. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Brad casually mentioned that the stairs in my house were becoming a hazard for someone in my fragile mental state. Tasha nodded in agreement, her voice dripping with fake concern, saying that she worried about me being alone during the day because I might leave the stove on and burn the house down. I have never left a stove on in my entire life. I was perfectly healthy, managing my own schedule, driving myself to the grocery store and maintaining a busy, independent life. Yet here were my own daughter and her husband systematically planting seeds of doubt, actively trying to convince me that I was spiraling into dementia. They were building a narrative piece by piece, that I was an incompetent, senile old woman who desperately needed to be institutionalized for her own safety. It was a terrifying, suffocating feeling. I spent nights lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my brilliant mind was actually betraying me. The psychological warfare was relentless, slowly chipping away at my confidence, leaving me vulnerable. Isolated and completely dependent on the two people who were secretly orchestrating my downfall. I began second-guessing my every move. I would write down everything I did in a small notebook, just to prove to myself that I was still in control of my faculties. I refused to accept that a woman who had managed entire hospital wings was suddenly losing her grip on reality. But the constant gaslighting from the daughter I loved more than life itself made the illusion incredibly convincing. The devastating reality of their psychological game finally snapped into focus the morning my debit card was declined at the pharmacy. The humiliation I felt standing at that counter was quickly replaced by a sharp, cold wave of clarity. The missing mail, the missing bank statements, the aggressive push toward an assisted living facility. It all suddenly made terrifying sense. I did not go back home to Tasha and Brad. Instead, I walked straight out of the pharmacy, requested an Uber on my phone, and rode directly to my main bank branch downtown. I marched past the teller line and demanded an immediate private meeting with the branch manager, a man I had known for nearly a decade. When we sat down in his quiet, glass-walled office, I asked him to pull up my accounts and explain why my card had insufficient funds. The manager looked at his computer screen, frowned in confusion, and then looked back at me with profound concern. He told me that my accounts had been almost entirely depleted. I felt the breath leave my lungs. I asked him how that was physically possible. He gently explained that 3 months ago, a comprehensive power of attorney document had been executed and filed with the bank. That document granted my daughter full unrestricted control over all my financial assets. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as he printed out the transaction history. I stared at the pages in absolute horror. Tasha and Brad had methodically drained my $400,000 retirement savings, transferring the funds in large, untraceable chunks. Every penny I had sweated for every sacrifice I had made over 30 years to ensure I would never be a burden in my old age, was gone. But the betrayal did not stop there. The bank manager hesitantly handed me another piece of paper. It was a notice regarding a massive reverse mortgage taken out against my house. The home I owned free and clear. The sanctuary my husband and I had poured our blood and tears into was now drowning in debt. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the power of attorney document. It was a flawless forgery of my handwriting. Tasha, my brilliant lawyer daughter, the girl whose law school tuition I had paid for with double shifts and aching feet, had forged my name to steal my life savings and mortgage my home. She had used her legal expertise not to protect me, but to orchestrate a sophisticated, ruthless financial robbery behind my back. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The gaslighting, the missing statements, the nursing home brochures. It was all a meticulously crafted smokescreen to hide their theft. They needed to declare me mentally incompetent so that if I ever discovered the missing money, no one would believe me. The profound, agonizing heartbreak I felt in that office threatened to shatter me completely. My own flesh and blood had sold my security for cash. I sat in that leather chair, staring at the forged signature, and allowed myself exactly 2 minutes to silently mourn the daughter I thought I knew. Then the tears dried up. The grief vanished, replaced by an icy, unbreakable resolve. I was not going to let them destroy me. I walked out of that bank branch, not as a broken, helpless widow, but as a woman systematically preparing for a brutal war. I did not shed a single tear on the ride back to my house. The profound, suffocating heartbreak I felt when I first saw my forged signature had completely solidified into pure, unyielding ice. When I stepped through my front door, the heavy air of my own home felt entirely different. Brad was lounging on my sofa, with his feet casually propped up on my mahogany coffee table, watching a sports game. He asked me where I had wandered off, to his voice dripping with that familiar, mocking condescension. I forced my hands to tremble slightly. I looked down at the floor, put on a bewildered, vacant expression, and told him I had just gone for a little walk and gotten terribly turned around. Tasha sighed loudly from the kitchen, rolling her eyes, and telling Brad that my mind was clearly slipping much faster than they initially thought. I swallowed my disgust, forcing a meek apology, and shuffled off to my bedroom, closing the door behind me. Let them think I was losing my mind. Let them feel incredibly comfortable and secure in their own arrogance. That very afternoon, while they were out spending the money they had stolen from my life savings, I made a crucial phone call to Mr. Henderson. He was a sharp, no-nonsense elder law attorney with a fierce reputation for tearing financial abusers to absolute shreds in a courtroom. I had met him years ago, when he gave a legal seminar at the hospital where I was the nursing director, and I knew he was exactly the kind of relentless bulldog I needed in my corner. We met in secret the following morning at a small, quiet diner on the other side of town. I slid the bank printouts across the table, carefully explaining the forged power of attorney and the devastating reverse mortgage. Mr. Henderson did not offer me empty pity or useless platitudes. He offered me a ruthless, methodical plan of attack. He told me we needed to build an airtight, bulletproof case, tracking every single fraudulent transfer and gathering overwhelming physical evidence before we tipped our hand. For the next 3 weeks, I lived a masterfully crafted double life in my own home. At home, I played the perfect role of the declining senile mother. I would intentionally ask Tasha the same simple question twice in a row. I would deliberately misplace my reading glasses and wander around the kitchen looking profoundly confused. Brad and Tasha ate the performance up completely. They grew incredibly careless, leaving their laptops wide open and confidential financial documents sitting right on the kitchen island, entirely convinced I was far too gone to understand what I was looking at. Every time they left the house, I was taking high-resolution pictures of those documents with my phone and securely emailing them directly to Mr. Henderson. I photographed bank routing numbers, offshore wire transfer receipts, and shady loan applications. I watched my own daughter smile sweetly in my face while secretly packing away my independence, but I kept my smile sweet and my mind razor-sharp. We were building a paper trail so massive and undeniable that no slick lawyer on earth would ever be able to save them from the devastating consequences of their greed. About a month into our silent, meticulous investigation, Mr. Henderson called me into his downtown office for an urgent meeting. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, his expression much darker and more serious than I had ever seen it. He told me that his private investigator had thoroughly followed the money trail, and what they uncovered was far more sinister than a simple case of greedy, entitled children. Brad was absolutely not the highly successful, wealthy financial consultant he pretended to be. In reality, Brad was drowning in a massive mountain of hidden toxic debt. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to dangerous private lenders and had completely ruined his credit years before he even met my daughter. The money they had systematically drained from my retirement accounts and the huge sum of cash from the reverse mortgage on my home did not go into joint investments for their future family. Instead, Brad had been meticulously funneling every single dime into an untraceable offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Henderson slid a thick, heavy file across the desk, revealing a stack of surveillance photos and confirmed travel itineraries. Brad was planning to flee the country for good. He had purchased one-way first-class tickets to a luxury tropical resort, but the second ticket was definitely not for my daughter. The private investigator had captured crystal clear, undeniable photographs of Brad intimately hugging and kissing a young blonde woman at a local hotel. She was his secret mistress, a girl he had been seeing for well over a year. He had used my stolen retirement funds to buy her incredibly expensive jewelry and secure a luxury beachfront property overseas, where they planned to escape and live comfortably together. But the most devastating, heart-wrenching revelation was yet to come. Mr. Henderson pulled out the forged power of attorney and the fraudulent loan documents we had gathered. He pointed his pen at the signature lines on every single page. Brad had manipulated the entire legal and financial process so that his name appeared absolutely nowhere on the official paperwork. Every fraudulent withdrawal, every forged signature, every illegal wire transfer had been executed exclusively under Tasha's name. He had convinced my daughter to sign the documents manipulating her by claiming he was handling the complex financial maneuvers to secure our family wealth and protect her from taxes. Tasha, completely blinded by her desperate, naive love for this smooth-talking con man, had committed massive federal crimes just to please him. She had deeply betrayed her own mother to fund a luxurious life with a man who was intentionally coldly setting her up to take the absolute worst of the fall. When Brad disappeared to his tropical paradise with his mistress Tasha, would be the only one left holding the smoking gun. The authorities would look at the extensive paper trail, see only her signatures on the fraudulent transfers, and she would be the one facing decades in a federal prison for elder financial exploitation and wire fraud. My heart physically ached for the brilliant, successful girl I had raised, seeing how easily and completely she had been played for a fool. She had traded the unconditional protective love of a mother for the poisonous, destructive lies of a coward. The perfect opportunity to finally spring our carefully laid trap arrived just a week later. Brad and Tasha decided to host an elaborate, fully catered dinner party at my house, inviting several of Brad's arrogant corporate associates and a few of our mutual family friends. Brad had proudly announced that he was celebrating a highly lucrative new business venture that was going to change their lives. I knew the ugly truth. He was celebrating his imminent cowardly escape, and according to the secret documents Mr. Henderson had found tonight, was the night they planned to publicly announce that my mental health had severely declined. They were going to tell all our friends that I would be moving into a locked memory care facility the very next morning for my own safety. The dining room was filled with the clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the loud, obnoxious laughter of Brad and his friends. I sat quietly at the very end of my own antique dining table, wearing a simple knitted cardigan, playing the part of the frail, confused elder one last time. Brad confidently stood up at the head of the table, tapping his silver fork against his champagne glass to command the room's attention. He put on his best, most sickeningly sincere face. He started giving a dramatic speech about the difficult transitions of life, about heavy family duties, and how it absolutely broke his heart to see my brilliant mind fading away into the shadows. He opened his mouth to officially announce my forced institutionalization, but I did not let him finish that lying sentence. I stood up straight. I pushed my chair back with a loud, aggressive scraping sound against the hardwood floor that instantly silenced the entire room. I reached under the table and pulled out the heavy, thick leather binder Mr. Henderson had meticulously prepared for me. I slammed it down right in the center of the dinner plates with a resounding, thunderous crash. I looked directly at Brad, my posture perfectly straight, my voice completely steady and stripped of any fake confusion or frailty. I told him there would absolutely be a major transition tomorrow, but it certainly was not going to be mine. At that exact moment, the front doorbell rang out loudly. The heavy oak front doors swung open, and Mr. Henderson stepped right into the dining room, flanked by two serious uniformed police officers. The colour instantly drained from Brad's smug face, leaving him as pale as a sheet. Tasha jumped up from her chair, her eyes wide with genuine panic, demanding to know what was going on in her house. I looked my daughter dead in the eye and laid out the absolute, undeniable truth. I exposed the forged power of attorney, the drained retirement funds, and the fraudulent reverse mortgage that had ruined my home. The dinner guests gasped in absolute horror as I pulled out the surveillance photos of Brad and his blonde mistress kissing outside the hotel. I threw the offshore bank statements and the one-way travel itineraries onto the table for everyone to clearly see. I turned to Tasha, my voice trembling with a mixture of righteous fury and profound sorrow. I told her that the man she had betrayed her own mother for was boarding a flight tomorrow morning with another woman, leaving her entirely alone to face federal wire fraud charges. The room erupted into absolute chaos as the harsh reality of the trap finally closed completely around them. The silence in my dining room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the polished hardwood floor. Brad stared at the thick stack of documents scattered across my antique mahogany table, his face draining of all that smug, entitled colour. The two police officers stepped fully into the light of the chandelier, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. Mr. Henderson stood tall beside them, a grim look of professional satisfaction on his face. Brad stumbled backward, knocking over his expensive crystal glass of champagne. It shattered violently against the floor, but nobody moved. He started stammering desperately, trying to construct a lie, but his fast-talking charm completely evaporated under the crushing weight of the truth, like the coward I always knew he was. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my daughter. He told the officers that he had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen money. He shouted that Tasha was the one who signed the power of attorney, that Tasha executed the reverse mortgage, and that Tasha was the criminal mastermind who stole my retirement funds. I watched my daughter's face contort in pure, unadulterated horror. Tasha looked at the man she worshipped, the man she had thrown her own mother away for, and saw him for the pathetic snake he truly was. She shook her head, tears instantly welling up in her eyes, crying out that Brad was the one who told her the documents were for a high-yield tax shelter. She begged him to tell the truth, to admit to the police that he had orchestrated the entire thing. But Brad just kept backing away, yelling to the officers that Tasha was a greedy lawyer who manipulated her own mother and that he was completely innocent. That is when Mr. Henderson calmly pulled out the final piece of paper from his leather binder. He cleared his throat and addressed Brad directly. He stated that while it was true Tasha's forged signature was on the bank documents, the financial forensics unit had tracked the digital footprint of every single wire transfer. All the money funneled into the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands had been authorized directly from Brad's personal laptop using his private IP address. Furthermore, the deed to the beachfront property overseas was exclusively in Brad's name, alongside the name of his 24-year-old blonde mistress. The dinner guests gasped in shock. One of Brad's arrogant corporate friends actually muttered a curse word under his breath and walked straight out the front door, wanting absolutely nothing to do with this mess. Tasha let out a guttural, agonizing scream. It was the sound of a woman whose entire universe was collapsing around her. She stared at the surveillance photos of her husband kissing another woman, the same man who had been secretly packing his bags to leave her holding the bag for a federal crime. The police officers did not waste another second. They moved forward, grabbed Brad by his tailored suit jacket, and swiftly pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp click of the metal handcuffs echoed loudly through the dining room. They read him his rights, charging him with elder financial exploitation and federal wire fraud. Brad kicked and thrashed, crying like a spoiled child, begging his former friends to call his lawyer, but nobody lifted a finger to help him. Tasha collapsed onto the floor right at my feet. She grabbed the hem of my cardigan, sobbing uncontrollably, her tears soaking into the fabric. She begged me to forgive her. She cried out that she was so blind, so stupid, and that she never meant to hurt me. She swore she thought they were just securing our financial future like Brad promised. My brilliant, successful daughter was reduced to a weeping, broken shell, completely shattered by the devastating reality of her own naive greed. She pleaded with me to save her, to tell the police it was all a big misunderstanding, to use my influence to make this nightmare stop. I looked down at the child I had carried in my womb, the child I had worked double shifts for, the child I had sacrificed my youth to protect. I saw the desperate fear in her eyes, the desperate realization that she was entirely alone. She gripped my hands, her makeup smeared across her cheeks, screaming for her mommy to fix it just like she used to do when she was a little girl. But I was no longer the soft, accommodating mother she could manipulate. I gently but firmly pulled my hands out of her grasp. I stood over her, feeling the heavy, cold weight of 30 years of maternal sacrifice turning into dust. I looked down at Tasha, not with blazing anger, but with a profound, bone-chilling disappointment. That kind of quiet disappointment is so much heavier than rage. I told her to get up off my floor. My voice was incredibly calm, completely devoid of the warm, motherly tone she had taken for granted her entire life. I told her that she sold my security, my home, and my dignity for a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. I reminded her of every time she sat on my couch and allowed him to mock my cooking, disrespect my home, and slowly try to convince me that I was losing my mind. I told her that she traded her soul for a cheap illusion, and I was not going to pay the price for her poor choices. Tasha begged me to help her fight the legal charges, crying that she would lose her law license, her career, and her freedom. She asked me to call Mr. Henderson off. I looked her dead in the eye and told her that she was a grown woman, an educated lawyer, and she would have to clean up her own mess. I informed her that Mr. Henderson had already filed emergency injunctions to freeze every single remaining asset, including her personal bank accounts, to recover whatever was left of my stolen retirement funds. I told her I was fully pressing charges for the forged signatures, and that the reverse mortgage company was launching a massive fraud investigation. I turned my back to her as the police officers hauled a crying, red-faced Brad out of my front door. Once they were gone, the house fell into a deafening, heavy silence. The remaining dinner guests had quietly slipped out, too embarrassed to stay a minute longer. It was just Tasha and me standing among the ruined dinner plates and half-empty wine glasses. I pointed a steady finger toward the front door. I ordered her to go upstairs, pack whatever she could fit into a single suitcase, and leave my property immediately. Tasha choked on her sobs, asking where she was supposed to go. I told her that was no longer my concern. It took her an hour to pack. When she walked down the stairs, dragging her suitcase behind her, she looked back at me one last time, hoping for a sliver of mercy. I simply pulled the front door wide open and waited. She walked out into the chilly night air, her shoulders shaking with every step. I closed the heavy oak door behind her and turned the deadbolt with a solid, satisfying click. The very next morning, I had a locksmith come out and change every single lock on my property. I hired a security company to install new cameras. Mr. Henderson worked tirelessly over the next few weeks, unwinding the fraudulent reverse mortgage and recovering the vast majority of my stolen money from the frozen offshore accounts. Brad was sitting in a federal holding cell, unable to post bail, waiting for a trial that would put him away for a very long time. Tasha was staying in a cheap motel, facing intense investigations from the State Bar Association and the banking authorities. She was facing the severe, crushing consequences of her own blinding greed. For the first time in almost 2 years, my house was truly quiet. It smelled like my sweet potato pie again, unbothered by anyone else's complaints. I sat at my antique mahogany dining table, sipping a hot cup of black tea, listening to the peaceful silence of my reclaimed life. I opened my laptop, typed in my favorite travel website, and booked a first-class ticket to Santorini, Greece. I had spent my entire adult life putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. I had bled for my family, sacrificed my dreams, and offered blind trust to those who did not deserve it. But as I finalized my luxury travel plans, I smiled a deep, genuine smile. My golden years belonged exclusively to me, and I was finally going to live them on my own terms. Listen to me closely, ladies. We pour our hearts and souls into our children. We bleed for them. We sacrifice our youth, our sleep, and our own dreams to build a solid foundation so they can stand tall. But hear me when I say this. Love should never mean laying down on the train tracks just so they can run you over. You cannot buy respect with a heavy bank account or a paid-off house. And you must never ever negotiate your dignity just to keep the peace in your own family. True family is built on genuine loyalty and mutual respect, not on what they can selfishly extract from you. If my journey resonated with your spirit today, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these powerful truths. Please drop a comment down below for me. Tell me exactly where you are watching, from what time it is right now in your part of the world. And most importantly, what you would have done if you were standing in my shoes when the truth came to light. I love hearing your thoughts. Remember your true worth. Stay strong, queens.